Welcome back to Arsenal Pass Time on the Round, episode 16. Today we're joined by Bryan Gottlieb, co-host of the competitive Magic podcast Arena Dickless. Bryan is also a broadcaster and writer for Star City Games. Anyway, Bryan, welcome to the show, and how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I just want to say thanks to you both for having me on, and also for being kind of my Sherpas in my quest to understand Flesh and Blood. You guys have been absolutely instrumental in getting me familiar with the metagame. I will tell you straight up, I listened to the Tales of Aria limited episode 3 times. 3 times,
Wow.
all the way through. Just really absorbing what y'all had to say and trying to get my head wrapped around the concepts you were putting forth. And I think it's working. I mean, the more I play, the more I feel like I understand. So I just want to say a huge thank you to you both before we even get any deeper in this endeavor. You guys have been awesome.
Yeah, we really appreciate that. It's awesome to hear feedback. Feedback that kind of makes it all worth it. I know I've been looking at your Twitter, and I remember seeing your Gauntlet deck post where you had I think it was like 6 classic constructed decks sitting out, and like that just gets me excited.
Yeah. I don't remember if it was 6 or 8, but I just like
It's growing.
I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know how each hero played, and I think the hero system is a huge part of the appeal of Flesh and Blood. I'm sure we'll talk about that more. But just when I was in my exploratory phase, I'm like, I want to experience all of this. I want to know what there is to offer. And there was a lot. And every time I finished one deck, I'm like, well, I can start doing this one too. So
That's the nature of this game. I think it's 1 is not enough, 2 is not enough, 3 is not enough.
Right.
Right. I want to ask obviously a bit about how you've gotten into Flesh and Blood. But first of all, could you tell us a bit more about just yourself? And Brendan said in the intro about the Arena Dickless podcast. You and Jerry have been podcasting from the Magic side for a long time now. Can you tell us a bit more about your background in TCGs?
yeah, so I am. I certainly qualify as an old head when it comes to TCGs. I think I started Magic in. I get it a little confused. It was either 94 or 95. I'm pretty sure it was 94. And obviously it remains a large part of my life to this day, given all the content I make. But I've dabbled in many other TCGs, both paper and digital throughout that time. And, in the 90s, there was this huge rush when Magic showed up and everyone wanted to cash in. And I played a bunch of those games. So Star Trek, Star Wars, Wyvern, Rage. There's just like dozens and dozens of these ultimately forgettable TCGs that I still experienced at that time. And Magic was really the only one that had any kind of staying power in my life. And I certainly came and went with Magic, but around like 2011, I got my first taste of competitive Magic, and I was super fortunate that the first ever competitive tournament I ever entered, it was a GP, a Grand Prix, which is kind of like a calling, basically, if you're not familiar with the Magic system. I did really well, and I qualified for my first Pro Tour at that, and then it just kind of hooked me on the highest levels of the game. And I focused on my career for a while. I was a lawyer for a few years, and with law school and doing that kind of had my focus, but I would always keep one foot in the Magic world. And I was on and off Pro Tours and never really made like a full run of it, but certainly was always around. And then just one day I had dabbled in a little bit of content here and there, wrote articles for smaller sites, did like 4 or 5 episodes of my own podcast once. And then one day my friend Jerry Thompson reached out and was like, do you want to hop on my podcast I'm running? My co-hosts are leaving to go work at Wizards. I said yes, and it kind of all snowballed from there. And the next thing I knew, that podcast just really took off. We got a great response. It was called the Game Podcast back then, now called the Arena Dickless Podcast. But we just kept getting more and more fans, and then I transitioned that into a writing job with Star City Games, and I started writing about Magic, and then I transitioned that into a broadcasting job with Star City, and doing play-by-play for Magic. And now it's been over 3 years where I've exclusively been doing Magic content. And that was not I wouldn't say it wasn't my goal, because it was in the back of my head, but I didn't think it was going to break quite that way. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, just happened. And, I know you have a lot of fans out there, and especially your broadcasting on the ECG tour, and, people love what you do. How long has, the Arena Dickless podcast, like I said, formerly the Game Podcast, been going? Because I feel like ever since I've definitely lived in Australia, I know that you two have been podcasting.
hard for me to pin down exactly how long we've been doing it. I think Jerry and I have been doing it for probably 4 years at this point.
Yeah.
And there existed a combination. Our friends Andrew Brown and Michael Majors were on the podcast with Jerry before that, and they did about a year before I came on board. So the podcast has been around for like 5 years now, which in the Magic podcasting space is almost forever. Like there's 2 or 3 other ones out there who have even more longevity than us, but a lot of podcasts come and go. And I'm sure we'll see that in the Flesh and Blood space too. Because as you both know, it's a ton of work to show up every week. Like it seems easy. You're just talking about the game you love, but you need to have interesting topics and guests and just the temerity to show up week after week. So it's tough. It's a challenging job.
Yeah, I'm sure you.
Well, I just want to say real quick, I think that that's one of the best things about having a co-host is that you do have that other person to motivate you. Like I kind of reflect on where Arsenal Pass has come so far, and it's only been, it's probably closing in on a year here decently soon. And I think that, it is a lot of personal work, but the thing that has definitely allowed me to stay committed and grow this to what it has become, what it will become is definitely like Hayden, because having that co-motivation and that person to keep you accountable is awesome. I'm sure you kind of experience the same thing on Arena Dickless.
Oh, absolutely. It also just helps that like Jerry's one of my best friends. If we didn't have a podcast, I would call him up to talk about nonsense and Magic probably every single week anyway. So the fact that we just get to record that with a little bit more polish, it sometimes makes it feel a little easier in those moments where it's like, I really don't want to record today, but you find a way because it's like, all I really have to do is go talk to my friend. Like that's not so bad.
Me and Brennan, we probably talk. We see each other a lot, even though we live in different countries and different time zones. I mean, we talk every day, see each other every day, which is, when we met, like you say, this part of a year ago, I didn't expect that to happen, and now every morning I wake up, I see his face, whether I want to or not. So
same, yeah,
blessed, truly blessed.
We do his mornings and my mornings, so I'm up at like 5:30, and then we start testing for 3 hours, which is, as long as we are competitive players, that's probably going to be a consistent schedule. But then after the, kind of the commitment to testing and trying to maintain being good at the game, Hayden and I, right after, he goes to sleep, he wakes up real early in the morning, and then we do the Arsenal Pass stuff. So it's definitely a grind now, but it's interesting where it becomes so repetitive that it's like meditative in a sense, where there's like this thing that you've remained disciplined to and that you do kind of no matter what. And it's like very calming and rewarding in some kind of, existential way, I guess, not to get too philosophical.
No, I get that entirely. And for years, I was a distance runner. Unfortunately, I've had some injuries lately. Awesome. But like it's very much the same type of thing where the actual thing you're doing in that second isn't always pleasant, but the collective of just like having this body of work, it starts to mean something more than just the action of putting together the cast.
Yeah. I want to know, before I want to ask you about, how you got into Flesh and Blood, but what distances did you run? Because I always find, to your point, distance running fascinating just because like the mind of a, body like aspect is just, it's crazy.
So my peak was I was training for my first marathon, and I actually broke my collarbone snowboarding basically right before I was going to do the marathon. So the longest run I did as part of my training was 21 miles, and that's as far as I've ever gone in my life. I've done plenty of like half marathon distances and things like that, but I never actually completed the marathon, and unfortunately my injuries kind of snowballed from there and didn't get back to that level ever. So that was basically where I peaked. It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to get back to it. Just like cumulative wear and tear on knees and ankles has kind of caught up with me.
Yeah.
But I still miss it all the time. It's really weird not having that be a big part of my life.
Snowboarding too. I guess if you were on the West Coast, right? So you had the best of both worlds there.
Yeah, Whistler actually was where I broke my collarbone up in British Columbia. So yeah.
Yeah, I've been to Whistler. So that's a cold place.
It is. It's very cold.
Is it cold? I like historically, like I kind of like when I was younger, I always hated the cold. But now that I'm living in Texas again, and experiencing the summers, I'm like, oh gosh. I mean, like we talked about this before we headed on the pod. Is like, very much considering moving to Seattle. And it's like I want the cold. So, but I remember when I went to Whistler, it was like -9 or something.
Oh, Whistler's intense. Seattle is more like, the thing I like about Seattle is that it's always hoodie and shorts weather. except for like 10 days a year. The rest of the time you get by, you put on your hoodie, you put on your shorts, or I mean, you can wear pants if that's your thing. I personally prefer shorts, but like mesh shorts and a hoodie 365 days a year, that's my jam right there. That's where I want to be.
It's like, that's like living back home in New Zealand is like that sometimes, or most of the time actually, which is great. Bryan, I wanted to ask about how you found out about Flesh and Blood and how you got into it, because from, I was pretty shocked actually to find out that, you were dabbling in Flesh and Blood, and we talked about this before we jumped on the pod, but you put up a picture of like some Dickless you sort of had, some decks, that you had, the new heroes. So, obviously in the past few months, it's come to be something that you've gotten into. And how did that happen?
I wish I could point to like an exact moment where I was just like, yep, time for Flesh and Blood. I mean, maybe it was actually the announcement of the pro circuit and finding out the details of exactly how that would work. Again, for people who aren't familiar with the Magic space, there's kind of this, I don't even want to call it a rebuilding. Maybe a dismantling is more accurate of a very long established competitive scene. And I do think something is ultimately going to replace it, but basically things have changed dramatically from how they were for the 20 plus years I've played this game. And basically Flesh and Blood kind of just like, well, we'll take that system. That was a really good system. It seems like we should go ahead and do this. And so at that point I was like, well, maybe it's time to see if this game is about something. And certainly I'd heard of Flesh and Blood. Like, it's hard to be in the TCG space and not hear of it. But I'll be frank, a lot of what I heard was either bad or just like finance related. Mm-hmm. Like, these cards are selling for so much money. How is this possible? Nobody plays this game. And I'm sure you guys have been around that, heard that, seen it. And I think, to be fair, that was my perception of Flesh and Blood. Like, what is this bizarre thing? I've never seen a human actually play it. So I was like, okay, it's time for me to see if there's something here. And I went to my local game store. I purchased the Monarch Blitz decks, which they had in stock. Sat down to play. And I was like, not only is this game entirely real, it's kind of brilliant. And it's brilliant in a way that isn't just parroting Magic. And I think that's the most special thing about Flesh and Blood. And if you look at like TCG history, I think it's going to serve the game well, because if you look at the things which have had this kind of, I wouldn't say equal, nothing has a run equal to Magic, but on the same playing field, I think it's just Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And neither of those games really plays anything like Magic. Like, certainly they derive a lot of their value from their tie-ins. Like, their cartoon properties are very worthwhile. But still, I've played both those games. I think they're both decent games. I don't love either of them, but I think they're both decent, and they're separate from Magic. Whereas you go to things like, maybe this is more the digital space, but like Hearthstone, Legends of Runeterra, there's always like, even if it's not directly derivative of Magic, there's always elements of Magic present. Like, combat feels very similar, or there's a mana system, and granted, like, Flesh and Blood has its resource system, but it's so different from the way Magic approaches things. And it's also, the thing that strikes me is, it's in the inverse of Magic, where you begin the game at high resources and you work down to lower resources as time goes on. And that's so fascinating, because it flies against so much of, I would say, the baseline game design knowledge. Like, you think about games like League of Legends, the whole thing is you're supposed to get more powerful as the game goes on and have that moment where you've completed everything. And I think Flesh and Blood sort of works in the opposite, but makes it work. And taking something that isn't really like supposed to work as a game concept and finding a way to make it way more interesting than a lot of the comparable stuff. It's so cool to me, and I appreciated it right away after playing a few games.
Yeah. What I love is that the player controls the power as you go to the later stages of the game, because the pitch is known, right?
Right.
So the idea of managing the resources of your deck, whether it be the power level or the exact order of the cards and the cards you want to be strung together as you draw them in the later parts of the game, it's the impetus is on the player to create that situation. I don't want to go too off topic, and I'm sure we'll get there eventually. There's one thing I read in one of your Twitter I don't know if you call it a review or what. You talked about variance. So Flesh and Blood obviously kind of has a sort of low variance aspect to it. And, a lot of people praise that and they really want that. And when we have, variance come into the game, like in Monarch or through Chain, there's like this pushback. But it is true that for a game to succeed, there has to be variance, right? It has to not be chess. And I think there was something you said is like everybody talks about that they want low variance, but you don't actually want that. And my biggest concern for Flesh and Blood for a while there was that maybe the variance would be too low, and there would be either a skill level or a group of players that would become too dominant to where it wouldn't be fun for other players. And I think that isn't what turned out to be true. But the saving grace before I kind of realized that wasn't going to be the case was that I think Flesh and Blood is fun a lot of the times, even if you lose, right? Because Flesh and Blood games are often not close in kind of like the finite resolution, but on life, they can be quite close, like almost every single time. I remember when you first start playing, it's always like, I was at 1, they were at 1, and then all this. But yeah, and I think that's like one of the greatest parts. Also, that ties into the role-playing aspect. People identify with their characters, but the fact that the game can be fun and you don't have to win it every single time is really important. And I think, actually Vegas showed that there isn't going to be kind of a singular group of players or a player that's going to be extremely dominant because they can manipulate, a low variance game to suit them kind of every single time without fault, which I think what I heard from other people was that has happened in other TCGs and has led to their downfall.
Yeah, the one that always comes to mind as far as that goes was like the Versus system TCG.
That was
based
the one
around, based around the Marvel characters, and it was essentially a no variance game, and the same people won every event, and that was certainly a big concern of mine when I first of all got familiar with like the competitive scene in Flesh and Blood and found out about Matt Rogers, who was just like winning every event basically, and at least at the exact moment where I was starting to understand like the Road to Nationals metagame and seemingly picking his hero at random and just going ahead and winning one of those events every week. It gave me a moment of concern, but I do think like there is enough variance that the better player certainly has an edge. I don't question that. But like you said, the fact that you can still have a good experience in the loss, and if there's just like that 20% chance for me to beat a great player, even at my experience level right now, I think that's enough to keep me going. It just can't go to 0. That's the whole thing. Like if you end up at 0, the game's buried and done. And I don't think that's the case. So
yeah, you don't want to be showing up to an event and whether you parallel this to a calling or it be, like a regional event, like a Road to Nationals or even a skirmish, even an in-store event, right? You don't want to show up and be like, well, I'm probably hoping for an X2 record. Like I'm hoping to win a few games. Like that's never where you want to be if you're going, purposely traveling to an event, or you always want to have, even if it's this small percentage chance, you want to have a chance to win, right? You want to have the ability to run hot on the day, or, to play really tight on the day, play some of the best games you've played and win an event, right? So I think that there's like a real, like you said, there's a line, right? You straddle this line between, is it not enough, the variance level? Is it too much variance? Is it just the right amount for the best players to get an edge, but for everyone to feel this ability to win games, which I think is, I think we've seen it kind of move across that line as the sets have come out, and to me it feels like they're probably on the right side of it, but it's definitely some of the concerns. I know that me and Brendan have talked about it multiple times, and it's interesting you talked about Versus system, because I know for a fact that a lot of the developers in this game have played Versus, and it was a big part of their TCG sort of, I guess, history and upbringing, and you can really feel it, I think, in the game that there is some aspects of how Versus system has certain design elements, whether it be something like we saw even in Monarch with like the soul, with cards tucking under other cards. Like we've seen elements they've pulled from other TCGs, right? They're not afraid to say, we'll take this from Magic, we'll take this from Versus, we'll take this from other TCGs. So it's a really interesting sort of melting pot that they've pulled together.
Yeah, I've sensed that as well.
Yeah. And so you went and picked the Monarch decks up. Just going back to I guess you getting into Flesh and Blood. Which hero did you actually start with? That's an interesting one. Which hero was the first one of those Monarch decks that you were like, this is what's sort of telling me about the game. I like this.
I think it was Bolton that really like resonated with me, and I don't know that I can tell you why. I just like I don't know, the concept of like soul I thought was pretty cool, and the resource management involved. It's hard for me now that I've played so much Flesh and Blood since that point to really remember like how the Bolton Blitz deck operates. But something about it at least hinted at the potential for there to be a lot buried in this game for me to kind of unwrap. And I also remember enjoying the Levia deck as well. Like managing blood debt seemed interesting. Sorry, that chain did not immediately appeal to me. I've actually kind of I've kind of been anti-chain during all my time with the game, even from like a constructed perspective. It's one of the decks that I didn't spend a lot of time on, not because I didn't believe what y'all were saying about how good it was. I absolutely believed it. It's just so separate from like what I had already established as the core of Flesh and Blood. It's like if Dredge was the best deck in Magic during Magic's first 2 years of existence. That's kind of the vibe I got from Chain. So
we were anti-chain as well, surprisingly. But we are to an extent kind of meta slaves. Chain was really though, he was different than kind of any other powerful strategy you've had in the game. He was fundamentally better than kind of everything, in my opinion, like over 50 on everything. The one redeeming quality of the chain deck was into control, specifically fatigue. You could craft a game plan that was, would kind of bring that matchup to an extremely low variance and in your favor. And to do so was one of the most complicated things I've ever done in Flesh and Blood, and was the most rewarding thing that I've, kind of practiced and put a lot of reps into, and then was able to replicate pretty much every time. So that was, the redeeming quality of it, but I am very happy that it is gone. And, we're back into an open meta that might be a little bit more rock, paper, scissory, and so much to explore now.
Yeah.
The experience of, sorry, Hayden, go ahead.
No, you go, Ryan.
So the experience of like solving the puzzle during the deck building and pre-gameplay stage really reminds me, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about Magic, but it reminds me of the most recent companion mechanic in Magic, which when it was debuted was super interesting, and the puzzle of like solving the deck building was awesome. And then you got to the point where you played the games and they played out all the same, and companions ultimately had to be completely changed how they function, because they invalidated so many aspects of the game that had come for decades before. I mean, it went back to the oldest possible formats of Magic. And that's kind of the vibe I was getting from Chain, is that like there's a puzzle here and it's a really cool puzzle to solve. But once you solve it, a lot of the coolness gets sucked out of the problem.
Yeah, it's not like solving. You talked about Livia, which is one of my favorite heroes that's been, published in the in the last year, and that's similar in some ways, right? Like you have your blood debt resource, you have this other sort of zone that is a resource, but it's in a different way. The management is, I think, is more difficult for starters, and also your games can look very, very different with that hero depending on how you play it, which is like a really cool aspect, I think, of Livia's design. And I hope we see more Livia in the future. That's for sure.
Same.
Yeah. Right. I wanted to ask as well, obviously started with the Monarch decks, played some games. We're almost 6 months removed from Monarch, and we're now into Tales of Aria. What was next? Because I've seen you post a lot of, obviously you've been cracking boxes, you've been cracking packs, you've been building decks. Like, what was your movement after Monarch? Like, what did you start doing after that? Did you start building Classic Constructed? Did you play small Blitz? Yep. Did you start playing Limited?
Yep. Classic Constructed was my next jump. Just because the metagame was developing. I was listening to y'all. It was obviously the focus of the community at that point. So that's where the most information was. So it made sense for me to just go and explore those decks. And also at that moment, I certainly hoped that I would be getting ready to participate and try and find my own road to nationals and, get more familiar with the organized play system. And it didn't quite work out that way. But regardless, once I started exploring the Classic Constructed metagame, I realized how much depth was there, and how much the individual heroes started speaking to me, and like how I wanted to learn everything about, like, oh, well, how does Katsu deal with this, and is this really how Dash is approaching this matchup, and those individual things started just screaming to me for more exploration. So I was just then grinding a gauntlet basically and playing every competitive constructed matchup I could just to learn, not with really like goals of mastering a matchup, just like understanding how does all of this work.
It's a really cool approach. Is there any heroes in particular that have really stood out to you that you really identify with, either from like a play pattern perspective that remind you of things in other TCGs that you've really enjoyed and you just you like playing those heroes?
Yeah, so I mentioned Katsu. Katsu's one that really the aggro Katsu builds in particular. I love the feel that you're putting your opponent in a vice. Like you just leave them with no good options because your chains can get so out of control so quickly if they find the wrong block, or if they ever like try to find their pivot turn and are willing to let you go. You can go so hard in so many spots. And knowing when to do so, I thought was really interesting. Seeing how the Katsu decks were capable of playing so many different game plans. Ultimately, I settled on like finding a real affinity for aggro Katsu, but still the fact that they were able to have control Katsu and these mid-range Katsu builds, it was so cool to see the flexibility of the hero, despite doing like kind of fundamentally the same stuff, with the exception of like, you know, a 12 card package, which changed everything, the entire matchup and how you would play it. So that was the first hero that really spoke to me. And then I find Bravo super interesting for its like big spell potential. Like it's kind of dumb and straightforward in a lot of ways, and like the goal feels to always do the biggest thing possible until it's like play defense, and then look for the biggest thing possible, and then play defense. And it has this kind of really natural ebb and flow, which also I think fits the character really well.
Yeah, does it remind you of when I first started playing the game? It reminded me of like kind of older style ramp decks from Magic that would do some
Primeval Titan. Yeah. Primeval Titan was the first thing I thought of for sure.
Yeah, which is really cool. I wanted to ask as well, you know, while we're talking about heroes and mechanics and things like that, you know, you have an extensive history in trading card games and Magic and other games, like you said, you've played. What are some of the, I guess, the key differences you think in Flesh and Blood, or some of the mechanics that you think work really, really well, you know, comparative to other games, or that have, you know, been iterative on other games you've seen in the past that you think are just going to help for the longevity of this game?
Yeah, I mentioned the sort of reverse resource flow that I feel, where your life total, and certainly this happens in Magic as well. You think of concepts like chump blocking and spots where you're put on the defensive, but the fact that as your life total decreases, your options kind of decrease, and then, you know, maybe you burn your equipment in a certain spot and you have less options that way. And the fact that you're kind of getting to this narrow point, well, I do think it can occasionally lead to end games that feel a little bit rehearsed. Like breaking out of that rehearsed pattern is a really cool challenge and a really cool problem to solve basically in every game you play. So I think that's really appealing. The resource system is strong as far as I can tell. I think it is like a appropriate amount of both variance and consideration that you have to put forth in deck building. Trying to think of other things that really stood out to me. I guess again, to make a Magic comparison, I believe you both are Legacy fans, so I'm sure you're familiar with like
some more than others. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm guessing you're familiar with like Storm decks.
Yep.
Playing games of Flesh and Blood to me feels like both players have a Storm deck in their hand, but you can also use your Storm resources to disrupt your opponent's Storm. And you're supposed to figure out on every turn, well, how much defense, how much offense, and how hard can I storm? And like, that's really reductive. And if you are only a Magic fan listening to this, which I hope I can bring some Magic fans to your work, and people can maybe find the game from here. And if you're only a Magic fan, that probably doesn't sound great to you. But there's so many wrinkles to it that it really doesn't do it justice. It's just kind of like a surface explanation of what's going on.
I want to pick up on that, because I think as you know, myself and Brendan both Magic players, yourself of course, Bryan, Magic player. What do you think are some of the things that, you know, if you were pitching this to another Magic player, what are some of the things you think from a player of MTG you think is probably really appealing about Flesh and Blood and as a game?
Resonance. I think that's the thing that Magic has always done better than any other game, is that the things that are represented in Magic feel like what they're supposed to. Your flying dragons feel huge, and they fly, and, you know, kind of like dominate over the battlefield, and they have the fire breathing effect, and all of it just, I don't know if it's just because I've spent so much time in Magic, but it all just has always felt right to me. Like from the first time I ever played Magic, your drudge skeletons putting themselves back together and regenerating. Like, that's right. That's what fantasy skeletons are supposed to do. Flesh and Blood does that in a way that I don't think any other TCG besides Magic has actually done for me. Like if I play the Pokemon TCG, Pikachu doesn't feel like Pikachu to me, right? Like that just, it doesn't click. I don't know what it is about the abilities, but it doesn't feel representative of the thing it's trying to invoke. Whereas Flesh and Blood feels like this kind of all-out battle between two combatants that are appropriately armed and then wear out their equipment as the fight goes on, and get exhausted and have fewer options and cling to their last desperate chances in battle. Like, I know that's being very dramatic about it, but it all works. It all feels right to me, and no other TCG has really done that for me.
I think you see that by people who really identify with certain heroes in this game, right? Like,
Sure.
they've got a main hero. They've got a second main hero. They don't like a particular class because in the traditional RPG sense, it just doesn't appeal to them, right? Like, that's never the sort of person I would want to be if I was, going through a game or going through a world. Like, that's not something I identify with. Whereas on the flip side of that, we have people who are really passionate about, certain heroes, and we've got our Azalea fans out there who, live and die on that Azalea Hill, who are the biggest fans, and I get it. Like, it's such a, all the heroes feel different as well from a mechanic standpoint, right? To the point where if you don't like one mechanic, that's fine. There's other heroes that you can play, and that's quite a nice feeling to be able to, even if you want to play more than one, then to bounce between those mechanics and explore those heroes and their sort of their differentiations.
Yeah, that sense of identity is going to serve this game so well, because it took Magic actual decades to develop that, and it manifested in the Commander scene, which is now the primary way of playing Magic. One of the reasons why competitive dinosaurs like myself are like, I'm not so sure this game's going to continue serving me, is because the focus on Commander has gotten so intense for good reason. I mean, that's what people have really, really bonded to. And immediately I could see the same type of things happening with Flesh and Blood. As you mentioned, people really cling to the heroes they identify with. And that seems like a small ancillary thing if you're like a diehard competitive player, like I usually am. But I know enough about this business now, having been around it long enough, to know that is probably the best thing that this game has going for it.
Yep. One of the things that makes me the most hopeful by far. And I experienced this kind of firsthand when I was in Vegas. It was not something I'm used to because I don't play locally as much, just because I don't really have the time. And then we also have our kind of our testing time, and the Arsenal pass time takes up a lot. So I don't really get to interact with a lot of these players who kind of play it from that angle. And I remember just a lot of the people that I met, they were just there to play. They brought their warrior deck, and like that was the class that they identified with, and all these kind of considerations of meta, chain, all of that doesn't matter because they just had fun playing warrior and being the warrior. And I think that makes me very hopeful for the game moving forward. It's like, we look at the success of Commander and Magic the Gathering, and I feel like part of me wants to be like, okay, how do we kind of recreate that in Flesh and Blood? Maybe not with as much of a company emphasis on it, but we need that casual player base, because that's ultimately what lets us who want to be competitive, that lets us do what we want to do.
Right.
And it makes, like, I think that the current system is really strong. Where it leads to in terms of like how casual gameplay or kind of tabletop plays out in the future, whether there is like an ultimate pit fight or just like Blitz becomes just kind of that thing that you pick up your deck and you play your friends with, that's still kind of to be decided, but the foundation is there, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think LSS is going to have to find their own way. I don't think, like, obviously I have never participated in an ultimate pit fight. My read on it is that I don't think it's going to work. But that's okay. It doesn't have to be the same thing as Commander. There's a way to still make your game casual and exciting that doesn't hit on those things. And the other way they're doing that too is, like, this hero system is great for identity, but it's also good for letting players come and go, right? Like, if you're a Katsu player, you can skip Tales of Aria, right? Like, if that's all you care about, this is a set you can sit out. And that's a little scary from, like, I want to sell all my packs, but like that's a good argument to make your limited environment really good and your sealed environments really good, and always have something to chase. Is it is a Fable going to keep everyone interested? Probably not, but I bet you'll get some casual packs cracked as people try and chase that one thing. So I think there's a very unique thing going on with a no rotation game that doesn't make cards for every deck in every set. And that's not something I really can think of an analog for. Like, I don't remember any other game trying to do that. And if they nail this, and it's going to be really hard because it requires a immaculate sense of balance, how far to push boundaries, how to keep things interesting without invalidating everything that's come before. I mean, we see that in Magic. That's a challenging thing to do. But if they nail this, they have an opportunity that I just don't think many other TCGs have had, because they do have this foundation of a non-rotating game that not every single card has to be considered in every single deck. And if the Welcome to Wraith Heroes remain competitive for 10 years, they've done something really special.
Yeah, I think the design of Tales of Aria is really interesting and pivotal in kind of the game's development and identity. And it's the first set where you can truly sit it out. Like, there is no generic to chase. There really is. Like, if you are, are playing kind of any of the heroes that are represented in the set, you can totally just not even buy into it. And whether my question is like, what I wonder is if this is good, like, is it's net positive to the player base? I mean, it feels net positive as being a player. Maybe it is. Maybe there is a negative aspect where people kind of aren't, bought in, or there isn't always that carrot to chase, so some people fall away. But is this a scalable model, and is this something that they should keep doing? Because, like you said, one of the main things going to be motivating sales after that is just going to be the limited format. So I think that's kind of an experiment that Legendary Studios is doing. It's probably core to their values, but I'm interested to see how that plays out over a few years.
You said something really interesting there, which is core to their values. And I think that's what it all comes down to, because if you think about how Magic has expanded in recent years, and this is not to naysay the path they've taken. I think they've done a lot of really smart things from a business perspective, but I trust me, I personally know this very well. Every time you do something from a business perspective, you're usually giving up a little bit of your soul. A little bit. Like, there's always a little piece of that wrapped into it. And, making a bunch of variants for your game can be giving up a little bit of your soul, or making sure you're pushing power level because that will sell packs can give up a little bit of your soul, or abandoning the kind of competitive core that you've always focused on in service of things that are making you more money. Well, is that giving up part of your soul? I'm not really sure on that one. Like, it's still obviously the core game, but you're doing something different. And ultimately, if LSS says to themselves, we are satisfied with the number of packs we are selling, we have this company, we employ a bunch of people, we love what we do, we love what we make, we're passionate about it, and we don't need to sell 10 million boxes of the next set. If that's where they fall, I think you can go ahead and, pursue whatever model best serves this kind of ideal version of the game. But business always rears its head, and it's always a balancing act. So we'll have to see where they fall on that spectrum. Are they going to want to have a reason for players to be involved at every single set, or are they comfortable with this model? And from a player perspective, I love this model. I think it's brilliant. But I can also identify the financial downsides of it too.
Yeah, I will keep flying this flag in terms of Tales of Aria, but it's a brave decision for players, but it's a much braver decision from a business standpoint to make the decision they have. And to your point, yeah, I mean, if this is one of their core philosophies and this is how they take the game, then they are really, I guess, showing up for the fact that they are player first, right? Like, they have as they've constantly said, we are player first. We are players making a game for players, and we'll see what happens. I'm optimistic that that'll continue, and I guess at the end of the day, they are they're an independent studio. They are smaller. They're coming out of a small part of the world. Like, they do have these things going for them, and as a New Zealander, I can say that we take pride in our small businesses out of New Zealand. So I think they have a lot going for them in that sense, in terms of staying true to their values, and I hope that continues, because it's it's a great piece of what has built this game so far. So excited to see where next. I did want to ask, you just talked about Limited before. Have you played any Limited? Because obviously Tales of Aria, as I said, there has been marketed for its Limited gameplay, for the fact that the set is one of the best Limited sets so far. Have you had a chance to dabble at all?
I have quite a bit. Now, have I dabbled in a way that allows me to evaluate how my skills are coming along? Not really, unfortunately. I play against my brother. My brother is also a longtime TCG player. He started Magic at the same time I did. So we have, I got about 3 boxes, split them into sealed pools. We have built sealed pools from that, played against each other. Beyond that, using FabDB, I've built about 30 Tales of Aria sealed pools, I would say, just like going through and getting comfortable with all the cards and understanding synergies. And then I take them over to Felt Table and I give the AI one of my pools and I take the other pool and I soundly beat the AI every time and feel real good about myself. Now, am I actually learning the game? Like, am I in a place where I'm going to show up at my first tournament and compete with good players? I have no idea. Like, there's no way for me to estimate that now, but I'm getting more and more comfortable. I feel like I'm learning a lot. I can look at two decks and tell you this deck seems far more powerful to me and be correct a large majority of the time. So that tells me I'm getting my fundamentals in place. But as far as like, do I have a good understanding of the limited format? I have no idea. I really don't.
But you come from a game that is, has limited. Not a lot of TCGs actually have. Surprisingly, if you are a Magic player or you're a Flesh and Blood player and you haven't played other TCGs, most other TCGs don't have a fleshed out limited system. It's an afterthought. It's something that comes about because players want it or because they want to sell maybe more packs. And I don't want to pigeonhole businesses, but that is a big part of how TCGs have entered limited before. Whereas Magic is also designed around the limited format, as is Flesh and Blood. So, how do you compare the two? I'm just going to ask you straight up, how do you compare the two limited formats? Do you think Flesh and Blood has a good limited gameplay experience?
I really do. I really do. And I was surprised at how good it was, given the introduction of Blitz Deck to Classic Constructed. I didn't really know what to expect, if Sealed was just going to feel like a powered down version of Classic Constructed. It doesn't. It feels unique. It feels like I am game planning in my deck building. I'm thinking about my end game, which it just tells me like this is not just jamming your cards together. There's something more here. There is a thoughtfulness. I love how the talents and classes interact in this limited format. I can't wait to draft it. I really hope I get the opportunity soon because I can just kind of. I was a big limited player in Magic. Certainly, like I'm probably more known for like deck building and constructed, but my best format has always been limited. Like I often say that in constructed, I have to get by with my metagame reads and my deck building, and that helps me make up for not being as good a player as some of the best. But limited, I've always felt world class and felt like I could compete with anyone. So I am very comfortable in that sphere, and the opportunity to do it with Tales of Aria, which, as I talk to players who have been around the game for a little bit longer, it sounds like this is sort of the idealized version of draft. Like this is finally how they envisioned draft when they were putting it together. So it's really cool that this is going to get to be my first experience. And it seems really promising to me just thinking about it, again, from a theory and game design perspective.
Yeah, it's I think we heard a lot about Tales of Aria Limited before the set came out. And I think, actually, Brendan, what do you think? I mean, personally, I don't think it's disappointed so far. I've been really impressed by especially the draft gameplay, but also the sealed gameplay.
Yeah, I mean, the draft it's definitely it's like the next level, right? Like I really enjoyed draft kind of in Welcome to Wraith, even Arcane Rising and Monarch, but Tales of Aria definitely feels different. And it's been interesting because we've been able to draft kind of in our group. It's only twice now, and I've drafted a few times in person, but I sense that in terms of like, the space to explore, the level of creativity you can have in your deck building is far greater than it was before. Where you had like these picks like generics and you could kind of stay open, and and then in this one you're staying open in elements, but elements are pigeonholing you into something else, and also the evaluation on your elemental cards are huge as well, because certain elemental cards only go into certain decks. And it's kind of the way you draft your resource base and your deck identity is just so different to anything else. I think it's really fascinating, and I think for draft it really is kind of the marquee format so far. And I'm excited because I feel like there's a lot of edge to be gained. And with nationals coming up, multiple callings and limited coming up, this is the set to do it, and I'm really happy about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great format. Been enjoying it so far. I wanted to, as we get into the end here, Bryan, just want to ask you a few final questions, and one of those is the question that we ask all of our guests that come on, and that's what's your future plans in Flesh and Blood? What does Flesh and Blood look like for Bryan going forward into next year?
A good question. I think a lot of that depends on what does the world look like. Yeah. Unfortunately, I have avoided really putting myself in higher risk situations thus far. Just in the interest of other people in my life, I'm fully vaccinated and like feel pretty safe doing these things. But you know, I spend time around children, and like I just don't want it on my conscience that like I went to go play a card game and it brought terrible consequences on someone else. So I've taken a very cautious approach, maybe overly cautious. I'll say that, but haven't gotten to do any kind of this live stuff. I'm getting to the point where I really want to put these things on my docket, find a way to do it as safely as possible. Mostly because I don't think this is ever going to end. So at some point, just to be like, am I ever going to do anything again? And I think the answer has to be yes, ultimately. So I really would like to make it to a calling. I don't think I'm going to make it to either Dallas or Cincinnati. I am considering SCG Con, which is the company I work for, Star City Games. They have a ton of Flesh and Blood events going on at SCG Con this year, which is weird. I mean, it's always been it's strictly Magic. There's nothing else that has ever happened there. And I am considering making that trip. And I probably will shock a lot of people when I sit there and play Flesh and Blood the entire time as opposed to playing Magic. But I think that's what I want to do. Long term, I would love to get involved on the content side of things. I think I want to know more. I want to know where I stand more before I really put myself out there. There's no benefit to me making subpar content, especially when you guys are doing such a great job making good content. I don't feel like that's something I need to hop into. But if I feel like I have something to offer, I'll definitely want to share that. And then I miss broadcasting so much. Like, it was always my favorite part of Magic. And, you know, the last 5 years have been way more about broadcasting for me than competing. And in fact, my games played in Magic were mostly so I could learn the format from a broadcasting perspective, so I could best convey the story to my viewers. And I am hopeful that I'll get to do the same thing in Flesh and Blood, because I think it's such an interesting game to call from a broadcaster's perspective. Again, like that reversed resource thing I keep talking about, it sets up these really good moments of tension at the end of the game. And I live for those moments of tension. Like, they don't always happen in Magic. Games can often be one-sided and you still are there calling it anyway. But the best moments of my Magic broadcasting career were like really narrow life deficits, and just like everything comes down to those very last turns. And like you mentioned, maybe it's not true, but Flesh and Blood always feels that way. It always feels like everything's up for debate until the last turn. So I think there's a lot I could do in the broadcasting space too, and we'll see if that develops over time.
Yeah, exciting. Well, looking forward to hearing you call some Flesh and Blood players. I think that's something that a lot of people would love to see. Cool, Brendan. Anything from you before we wrap up and head to the end of time in the round?
Yeah, I mean, just in the sense, I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's awesome to kind of, get your perspective and get the perspective of someone who's been, heavily focused in Magic the Gathering. And I'm particularly interested in, someone who's been on the broadcasting side, because I think that's going to be, I hope that's what's going to be what carries us as we go into this Pro Tour season in 2022. And with the kind of backing of Channel Fireball so far and kind of the proof of concept in Las Vegas, I think that the broadcasting and the way this game is displayed to the public can be taken to a level that's going to push it to greatness, right? And the execution of that is what I'm most excited for. And yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on. And I want to, before we kind of wrap up and do the time of the round or whatever, why don't you go ahead and kind of shout yourself out, plug yourself, your podcast, all that good stuff, Twitter.
Sure. Yeah, you can check out our podcast everywhere. I prefer Spotify. That's where I listen to Arsenal Pass, but just search for Arena Dickless. You'll find it over there. If you want my completely nonsensical and nonstop ramblings, you can head over to Twitter at Bryan Go, BRYANGO. I don't recommend it. I cannot wait for the day where I am able to just wander off Twitter and never come back. It's a horrible, horrible place, but this is what I do for a living. So I got to put myself out there and tell you about my content. And I try and make it at least, I don't know if amusing is the right word, interesting. I try and make it interesting over my Twitter page. So you can check me out there.
Cool. All right. We'll drop your details as well in the description. But thank you so much, for Bryan, for coming on.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Anyway, well, active player turn 0, one additional turn. That's
Time in the round.